Lewis, the director of IIEP, and it's really a great pleasure for me to moderate today's debate with our longtime colleague, Pauline Rose. The series of strategic debates for IIEP this year have a focus on equity dimensions of the Education 2030 agenda. So it's particularly wonderful to have Pauline Rose speak with us today, sharing the analysis that she has done recently published by the Education Commission, the International Commission for Financing Global Education, yes, the Norwegian Education Commission, as we refer to it. But it's very good that she's speaking with us today on the interesting concept of progressive universalism and the impact of inequalities on learning achievement. I should say that the seminar is being simultaneously interpreted by our very good interpreters. Thank you for being here today. So we have English or French as you desire. And when we move to the discussion, please speak using the language you prefer. We would encourage that very much. So we're very pleased that Pauline is with us. Pauline is, I'm going to read her bio as soon as it comes back on my phone, sorry. So let me introduce Pauline, and how the format is the following. So I will introduce Pauline and give her a chance of 50 minutes or so to present her analysis. She's actually presenting analysis from two different papers, so it's very interesting to see how she has put them together. And then I will start with some discussant comments to mainly to kick off the discussion, and then we open it up to the floor. And I always like to foreshadow that please don't run out the door at the end. On rez-de-chaussée, we will have for your reward a cocktail, and it's also an opportunity for all of us to interact informally, to continue the discussion, for you to have a word with our speaker. I thank all the colleagues for being here. Many of you I recognize, some of you I don't, but I look forward to introducing myself to you. I particularly want to say how pleased we are to have UNESCO's regional director from Nairobi with us, and it's a pleasure to see you here. The education sector has a senior leadership meeting tomorrow, so I think that's why we are benefiting from Aunt Teresa's presence. And I thank all the colleagues and our training program participants for being here, UNESCO colleagues from across the river, etc. We really welcome you. So I forgot to tell you we were about to start. Okay. We are live streaming this seminar, as we try to do all of our strategic seminars these days. And we are also tweeting, and the hashtag would be #strategic debate. Quite simple. So we encourage you to participate in that. There are still seats in the front, so I encourage you to come forward. Well, with no further ado, let me introduce our colleague Pauline. So Pauline joined Cambridge University in 2014 as Professor of International Education. She's the director of the REAL Center, Research for Equitable Access and Learning Center in the Faculty of Education at Cambridge University. She also serves as Senior Research Fellow for the UK Department for International Development, DFID. But many of us know her because prior to going to Cambridge, she was the director of the UNESCO EFA Global Monitoring Report since from August 2011 till when she departed in January 2014. And she directed two reports, the one on youth skills and work, and one on teaching and learning, both of which were very important as part of the run-up to the new agenda, and very influential as well. Before she became director of what was then the GMR, she worked as senior policy analyst with the team for 3 years, leading the research for 3 reports on the themes of governance, marginalization, and conflict. And so that's having lived through five GMRs, one does need to take a break, but Pauline's talents and expertise were recognized, being given a chair at Cambridge University. We were very excited when that news broke. Pauline is the author of many publications on issues that examine educational policy and planning, including in relation to inequality, financing and governance, democratization, and the role of international aid. Pauline is known for her collaborative spirit, and in fact, she runs several collaborative research programs with teams in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that examine the issues that she's focused on in her career. She's worked a lot with international aid donors and NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and is very much committed to providing evidence-based policy advice on a range of issues. So we're very pleased that you're able to come over from Cambridge and for this afternoon's seminar. Thank you very much, Pauline.
Thank you. Is this on okay? Yeah. And it's great to be here back in Paris. It feels like a long time, and it's lovely to be here in IIEP. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the debate. So I'm going to be presenting, as Sue said, two papers that we in the Real Centre produced for the Education Commission report. This is very much a collaborative of a number of colleagues within the Real Centre, so I'm presenting on behalf of all of them. For those of you who don't know, the Education Commission is I think they like to call themselves a movement rather than a report, but the first step was to produce a report that came out last September that was launched at the UN General Assembly by the Secretary General at that point, Ban Ki-moon, and I think had quite a big impact. It was headed by Gordon Brown, and it's got a number of commissioners, former presidents, heads of states, and various other very high-profile colleagues who have really, over this coming and past year, been promoting its messages. So it hasn't just been a report that sat on a shelf. So I think in that sense, the input of the way that they've used the evidence and the fact that that evidence continues to live has been extremely important. So we were very pleased to be part of that process in helping to form the evidence base. And in doing this, our key concern within the Real Centre was really to make sure and hope that evidence would be at the forefront of the report that would promote issues around addressing inequalities. And I'm very pleased to see that that did end up as one of the key messages. I think that there's always a danger of a balance of trade-off of things that get higher on the agenda and get pushed down. So I'm always keen when I hear the colleagues from and friends from the Education Commission present to hear that they are including this as part of that and continuing, I think, to sort of make sure that this is central to the discussions. So the two, we produced three papers, the two that I will be referring to here. One is looking at the inequalities within countries to achieve global convergence in learning. Another was more specifically on issues around domestic resources. As we know, the main resources that support education systems are from national governments. So although we need to continue to promote the best use of international aid and the need for increase in international aid, the need for external resources of other kinds, we also really need to make sure that not only do we have a sufficient domestic resources, but they are used in the most appropriate ways to reach the most marginalised. So these were the two of the papers. Another one was a case study of CAMPED, a very large and important non-governmental organisation that works on girls' education in sub-Saharan Africa. And that paper shows more specifically the impact that CAMPED's programme has on improving the education, secondary education in particular, of marginalised girls. So just to put this in context, I'm sure everybody in this room and on the live stream can recite the Sustainable Development Goals off by heart. I'm not going to try and do it, but I think one aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals that our work has really focused on relates to the issues around the targets on and indicators on learning and questions about what we should be measuring in learning, at what levels and for what purpose. And so one of the things I'll be presenting today will relate to a concern that we've had, along with others, about the importance of measuring learning from the early ages and the early grades. Because if that isn't done, it's too late to address the problem. So I'll be coming back to that. So some of you might know that perhaps one of the most hotly debated indicators for the Sustainable Development Goals has been this one, 4.1.1, that looks at I don't actually know if it's still there or not, because it kept going in and being taken out again, looking at the proportion of children in grades 2 to 3 achieving at least a minimum proficiency level in reading and maths. So this has been quite hotly debated, because we shouldn't be assessing children at that early stage, whereas some of the others of us would be saying we can and should do it, not in a way that is high stakes, but in a way that helps us to identify where children are struggling from an early stage and who it is that's struggling and how to do something about that. So that's just putting it into the context of the Sustainable Development Goals, putting it into the context of the Learning Generation Report, the Education Commission report overall. The main focus of our work links up with this message that was one of the messages in the report on progressive universalism, which identifies that, this is a quote from the report, we need to give greatest priority to those children most at risk of being excluded from learning, so unequal opportunities in one generation do not lead to unequal opportunity outcomes for the next. We can accomplish this only through a progressive universalism that will combine a commitment to every child with more resources devoted to those children who need most help. So this requires us both to identify those children who need most help and to ensure that resources are distributed to them. So that's the focus of, that's the issues I want to focus on today. I'm going to be showing a lot of graphs, so I'm afraid I like graphs, so I hope others in the room like them, and if anything's unclear, do wave your hand. The graphs are primarily from these data sources. Of course, the very important UNESCO Institute for Statistics database, which is the core of any education data that we use. Demographic and health surveys, which are household surveys being undertaken in a number of low and middle income countries. And then two more sample-based household surveys, which have been undertaken in a number of countries. One are what are called citizen-led assessments, for those of you that know ASA and OASO, in India, Pakistan, some countries in East Africa, now expanding outwards, but the countries in India, Pakistan, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda are the ones which our analysis focuses on. Very large scale, they're sample-based, but very large, they reach very large numbers of children. And I think what's unique about them is that the data are collected through a sort of citizen-led community approach, with the idea that it's not just about collecting the data and saying whether learning is good or bad, but also providing that feedback and knowledge within communities that can help ultimately to make a difference and lead to action. The other database that I'll be talking about is Young Lives. Again, a really important database that provides longitudinal data that tracks children over time. So it's tracked cohorts of children from their very early years, and they are now reaching the stage by which they could be in higher education. So this, for some of these poorer countries, is quite unique. Not many countries have this rich data set. So we're looking at, so the data has been collected, not by us, but we have been able to use the data and have access to it from Ethiopia, Andhra Pradesh in India, Peru, and Vietnam. The sample size for this is somewhat smaller than the citizen-led assessments, but still allows for some quite granular level of analysis, which I'll come on to. A lot of my analysis will be talking about the importance of understanding what is happening for the poorest. Now, before I go on to discuss that, one thing to bear in mind is it's actually quite difficult in many contexts, or in almost all contexts, to measure poverty, to measure what people have, what resources people have. The most common approach in these different surveys that I was mentioning that's used is an asset-based index that includes things like house type, mobile phone, television, electricity, so issues around things that those households own or have access to. There might be, in a demographic and health survey, they have more indicators than this. I think these are the ones that are primarily in the ASA and OASO studies, but there are others in others. So this, although this might sound crude, it has actually been tested to see how well it does measure wealth, and many studies have shown that it is a good way to measure wealth. So that's just a bit of background. So then coming to my first graph. This graph looks at whether or not children, whether the children are in school or not, whether they're learning the basics. Along this line here, we have the richest, and in that direction we have the poorest. So this isn't only testing those or taking account of those who are in school, because we know that many of those who aren't in school are quite likely not to be learning. So we need to not forget those who aren't in school. Many times learning assessments only take account of those in school. And there's a couple of things I think this graph identifies. So this is primarily countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and I mean there are some Latin American countries, primarily low and low middle income countries, for which we could access data. So the reason countries are here is because we had data, not because we chose to include them. So a couple of things. One is, if we look at the richest, we see actually they're not doing too well on learning in these countries. So it is a universal problem. It's not just a problem of poverty. It's a problem overall. There's a problem of the quality of education, or of children getting access to good quality education overall. So we can see in this pink box here, there's a number of countries where amongst the richest, 25 to 75% are learning the basics, are down to learning the basics. But an even greater concern is that when we look at the versus the poor, if they were doing equally well, we would see all the points along this line here. But we don't. We see that they're all squeezed down here, which shows that it's the poorest that are doing almost every time worse than the richest. So almost all of these countries, the poorest, there's less than a quarter of the poorest who are learning the basics. So less than 1 in 4 of the poor are learning the basics. What does this mean when we're coming to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals? So we're saying that by 2030, we're wanting all children to achieve basics. Of course, we need to define what the basics are. Countries will define it differently, but just as a sort of crude level of all children in these countries being able to perform the basics in terms of mathematics, division, reading a story. What is it that we see? So if we look at this starting point, we can see in all these countries, again, the learning levels are low, but in all of them, the blue line, which is the richest, is above and sometimes significantly above the red line. So if we were to continue as business as usual, we would have a huge problem. If we're going to achieve this goal by 2030, it's clear we need the progress of the poorest to be accelerated, to be even faster than the richest. But we know historically that the pattern is often the other way round, or is usually the other way round. So something needs to be done differently if we're going to move from the business as usual to this outcome that we have set ourselves. Now, coming back to a point that I was making earlier, it's really important to remember that it's not only about those children in school and whether they're learning, it's also important to remember that children are still out of school. A bit of a danger and some of the sort of rhetoric around the Sustainable Development Goals and some national governments who would like to claim we've dealt with a problem of access, all children are now in primary school, we need to move up the system and we need to focus on the quality. Moving up the system and focusing on quality are fundamental, they're really important. But we mustn't leapfrog over those who are still even not getting access to school, some who aren't enrolling at all, and many who drop out before completing a cycle. So this is rural Pakistan. This is using the ASA dataset, and it shows again the blue bars, which are the richest, and the red bars that are the poorest. And you can see amongst the poorest girls, around 40% of them are likely to be out of school. So this is a huge number. Pakistan is perhaps at the more extreme, but it's not unique. So if we were to say we've dealt with the access problem, this is what we would be missing out. We would be forgetting a huge number of these poorest girls in rural Pakistan. And of course, quite a number of the poorest boys there as well. So then when we come to look at, okay, what does this mean for their learning? What we see is for these poorest girls, the 60% who, or below 60% who are in school, about half of them are learning the basics. So even though they are in school, only a half of them have a chance to learn the basics. Again, sort of reading a story, doing basic division, etc. Oh, this one is actually subtraction. So this is quite even more basic. This is just they can do a subtraction. Only half of them, they've been in school, only half of them can do subtraction. But if we see amongst those who are no longer in school, they might have spent a bit of time in school, but they aren't in school anymore. Almost none of them can do subtraction. So we have to remember that there's a dual issue here. There's one issue about those who aren't even getting into school. There's another issue about those who are getting into school but aren't learning. Now, I think it's really great that the debate with the Sustainable Development Goals has given a much bigger focus to leaving no one behind. That has been central to the discussions on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's been, as I said, also an important message within the Education Commission report. And as part of that, the debate on who we need to be thinking about in terms of leaving no one behind has also extended to groups that have previously been invisible. And children with disabilities has been one of those. So those that have been invisible have often been those who it has been difficult to count. And it has been difficult to identify children with disabilities, and therefore they have often missed out on being visible in terms of whether or not they're getting access and learning, which in turn has often meant that they've been invisible in debates on national policy. So we've been really fortunate in working with colleagues in ASA Pakistan in including identifiers of disability within their ASA dataset. So as a first message, this shows it is possible to identify children with disabilities. It's no longer an excuse to say we can't do it. We can do it, and we have done it, and others have done it. What we're using here is a common approach that has been developed by something called the Washington Group, along with UNICEF Mix, that some of you might be familiar with, that have identified questions that can help us to identify children with disabilities. So it is possible to do it. And when we do it, we see some quite interesting patterns. So this is just some preliminary analysis that we have been undertaking. One of the things is that, one thing it's quite difficult to sort of identify different types of disabilities, and it's been important to do so, and also important to look at the severity of disability within that. But one of the things that struck us when we did this sort of initial analysis was that this is in rural Punjab, so it's a sort of wealthier province in Pakistan, but by no means wealthy, and there's still quite large numbers out of school. But actually, interestingly, quite a reasonable proportion of those with what are classified as being an understanding difficulty are actually in school. So that is quite surprising in many ways. Those with physical disabilities are actually less likely to be in school. But even so, there's still a good over 60% of them in school, which I think we were quite surprised at, because a lot of the debate in many countries is about the stigma attached with having a disability, of parents not wanting to send their children to school. So, but what we found, and what work by my colleague Nidhi Singhal shows very clearly, is that actually parents often do want their children with disabilities to go to school. It's just that they don't have the resources, or the schools aren't set up to enable them to go to school. So the stigma argument can be a bit of an excuse. But the problem is that once they're in school, they don't have the support, they don't have the infrastructure there, they don't have the additional aids they need to enable them to learn. So, as I've shown before, even amongst children without having these difficulties, a number of them aren't learning the basics. We've got about 60% here who are, about 40% who aren't. Of those who do make it into school with physical disabilities, some of them are learning, but still lower. It might be large amounts of absenteeism. It might be because there are some other difficulties they're facing. There could be a number of reasons which one would need to explore. But importantly also, of those with who've been identified as having an understanding difficulty, none of them are learning. So although they're going to school in reasonably large numbers, none of them are learning. Now in some ways, surprising. It should still be surprising, because with the right support, this picture could change. Coming back then to the population more generally, now looking at rural India, we had data over longer period of time for India, for which we looked forward at what was happening with children as they progress through the ages, of these ages being the ages for which they should be in primary school. So some of them are in primary school, some of them aren't. And what we see is, again, as the graph I was showing earlier, huge gap between the blue line, the richest, and the red line, the poorest. The dotted line on this are the rich boys on the blue, and these are the poor boys, and these are the poor girls. So what we can see is that even at this sort of initial stage, before they've hardly had any schooling exposure, there's already a little bit of a gap. But as we go through, this gap gets wider and wider as those from richer households have a chance to learn, do over time manage to learn the basics. But those from the poorer households stagnate. Very few of them are able to move from where they were to being able to learn the basics. So we end up with, by the age of 11, only around 7% of poor girls having achieved the basics in rural India. And with this massive gap. So what we were seeing previously, before the SDGs and before sort of, I would say, the debate on leaving no one behind became as sort of focused as it has now, we were often seeing just average figures being produced. So it was telling us that learning wasn't great, an important message. But what we weren't seeing is who it was that wasn't learning. And I think importantly here, what we see is not just the gap between the richest and the poorest overall, but the gender difference. So as many of you debate at the moment, really pushing up the agenda on girls' education, a really important debate being championed by many high-level leaders, saying that this is really central. But of course, that's not a problem amongst the richest. The gap between the richest boys and girls is almost insignificant. The problem is here amongst the poorest. So really that debate needs to focus on the most marginalised girls, not just on girls overall. There might be sort of various things that are happening, gender-based violence, issues around security, issues around what happens when girls reach puberty and so on. But we really need to be looking at this in a more disaggregated way. Now, the question is this all inevitable? You know, is it just, okay, the poorest, that's just what's going to happen, what can we do about it? It's not inevitable, and I think in this room I'm sure we would all agree it's not inevitable, but we have some evidence to also support the fact that it's not inevitable. So what this graph shows us is this is looking at the gap between the richest and the poorest, what the percentage gap is between the richest and the poorest in these three East African countries, Tanzania, Kenya and Uganda, taken from OASO data. So we can see that when we're looking across all government schools in these countries, the gap is about 25%. But when we look at those schools where we have poor and wealthy children mixed in the same schools, that gap drops significantly. So the gap is now only 10%. There's still a bit of a gap, but much smaller gap. And then when we look at them in the same classes, where we see that they're not segregating for one reason or another, whether through tracking or other reasons, the rich and the poor, that the gap falls even further to just 5%. So when poor children are in the same schools, with the same resources, with the same teachers, with the same infrastructure as wealthier peers, they have almost the same chances of learning. And that is a really important message, because a lot of the debate is about, okay, government schools are failing, we need to sort of change from a government. That's not the issue. It's to do with the resources that schools have, regardless of whether they're in the private sector or whether they're in the government sector. Now, I've been talking about primary education primarily because that is where the problem starts. But of course, we need to look higher up the system. And I know that previous strategic debates, you looked at higher education. I think this graph just reinforces one of the messages there, that overall levels of access at higher education, this is primarily countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, is very low. But also, importantly, for the poorest, almost none of the poorest are able to get in. So the green bars that you can only really see at this end are the poorest. Down this end, you can't even see that there are any because there's so few of the poorest getting in. Now, why are there so few getting in? One can say it's because of financing for whatever reason, but actually the main reason is because they're not making it through primary and secondary school. So this graph is just showing in sub-Saharan Africa the proportion of those who are completing lower secondary, and we can see that amongst the poorest girls, only about 5%. So it's hardly surprising that you've got fewer than 1% going to higher education when so few of them are getting to the end of secondary. And then working backwards, even at primary level, only about a quarter are completing. Many of them might now be going, but they're not getting to the end of primary school. So we really need to look at the system overall and look at what happens through the transitions from one level to the next. When we looked at this in relation to, okay, who is getting access to higher education, and trying to look at this across these different dimensions, and this is now using the Young Lives data set that I mentioned, again, we can see, not surprisingly, a big gap between the blue and the red, the rich and the poor. In Ethiopia, the gap is small because there's a smaller number going overall. But when we then looked at whether at age 8, whether the richest children were learning, that has an effect on whether they get to higher education. But that effect is even greater for the poorest. So if you have the double whammy of being poor and not learning at age 8, so not learning, at that very early stage, you have a very small chance of getting into higher education. So this suggests that we really need to do something not only about addressing the effects of poverty on education in general, but also what's happening in the terms of the quality at that very early stage, because there's very little chance of catching up later on unless we've addressed it early. So this then moves me on to the sort of second issue that I wanted to focus on, which I'll do more briefly, which is around the financing, which relates to the message in the Education Commission report on progressive universalism. So that message on progressive universalism is about prioritisation. We know that in education we want more resources. We know everyone else wants more resources. We're hopeful that the Education Commission is going to help to mobilise more resources. That's what they're out there championing. So hopefully they'll be successful. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about the pot of money we have and work out how best to use what's there. So these are messages in the Education Commission report. Firstly, that funds be allocated for those areas for which there's highest return activities and to those least able to pay. There might be trade-off even between those two things. And this implies strongly favouring the allocation of public funding to the lower levels of the education ladder, and within that to those left behind. So that very much relates to what I was showing earlier as to where the problem lies, and the Education Commission saying that's where we need to focus resources in order to correct that problem. But what do we see in terms of the current situation? We see a very different picture to that. The issue is not of the poorest being prioritised, but rather of them missing out. So this graph again looks at a number of countries and looks at the proportion of resources within these countries that are spent on the education of the richest to the poorest. Up the top here we have Nepal, which is a positive country. I don't know if anyone here is from Nepal and might have a view on how correct this is, but almost the same amount of money is spent on the rich and the poor overall, on average, in Nepal. If we go down to the bottom here, Liberia, a very controversial country at the moment, for those that you know, sort of implementing a private-public partnership program, recognising huge problems that there are within the education sector. At the moment, less than $10 is spent on a poor child for every $100 that's spent on a rich child. So it's hardly surprising, it's a bit of a causal issue here, but that's sort of driven and drives the fact that we have these huge inequalities. And many of the countries are at this end of the graph. They're not at the Nepal end. We've got very few countries that are showing almost, not even balance, but closer to a balance between the amount spent. So if the same amount was spent on a rich and poor child, we would see them all on this line. That's where they ought to be. And that would be equal. That wouldn't be equitable, because an equitable system would be giving more to the poorest than to the richest, but we see none of that. When we look at this disaggregated by level of education, again we see a picture that again is maybe not surprising, but in another sense is shocking. So we see at the primary level, primary spending can be pro-poor, it can be equitable, so more being spent on the poorest and the richest. We get to secondary, it's always pro-rich, and in a country like Mozambique, around 25 times more is spent on a rich child than a poor child. When we get to higher education, it's just off the end of the spectrum. And that's for two reasons. One reason is because of the greater numbers who are in higher education who are from rich households. So if you almost none from poor households in higher education, then of course almost none is being spent on them. But it's also about the amount of money that goes to higher education relative to some of the other levels. So I think, you know, although in some ways this is quite simple analysis, it's quite a striking picture. So then this leads me to what we need to think about in terms of what needs to be done. So I'm going to keep the policy messages quite broad, and we might want to sort of extend this into the discussion. And obviously any of this is contextual, it will vary by countries, but these are more principles that can cut across. So first of all, the monitoring of the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said at the beginning, I think it's a huge way forward. The Sustainable Development Goals now focusing not only on access, but also learning. The two are important. But that our message from our analysis shows very strongly that we should be tracking progress from the early years, and that we need to be tracking progress both for those of learning, both of those who are in school and those who aren't in school. If we only look at those who are in school, we're skewing the picture. We need to tackle disadvantage early. We need to identify and implement policies that are associated with disadvantage in those early years. I'll come back to that in a second. And importantly, we need to use data. We need to use the data that we have on access, learning and financing, and we need to improve the data that we have on access, learning and financing. I know your IIEP here are doing some great work on this. They work on the national education accounts, on the formula funding, looking at how countries can best use the resources, how to get formulae that can allocate resources more fairly. So I think there's some really important work that's going on. We need to make sure that countries apply this and apply it more universally. Then what are some of the sort of disaggregating what we need to do in terms of tackling disadvantage? Now, of course, a lot of the issues around tackling disadvantage happen outside of the education system. So there are things that need to happen outside of the education system, what is happening within schools. But given that I think primarily we're here because we're people who are working on education in some way, what is it that we as educationalists can do to make a difference? So one is about the real importance of supporting early childhood programs. I think, interestingly, this is again increased up the agenda. There's a very strong message around it. The evidence is very clear. Supporting early childhood education programs has benefits for children when they go into school and later in life, and it benefits disproportionately the poorest and the most disadvantaged. It's a no-brainer, but in fact, a very small proportion of government budgets and of aid budgets goes on early childhood. So I think, you know, although it's a no-brainer, the brains aren't there to be doing something about it at the moment. The second point is about ensuring teaching is at the right pace. So we see there's a lot of evidence from India in particular, great work that's been done by J. Powell in conjunction with ASA, along with others, showing that often the teaching is at the pace of those that are already able to learn. It's not at the pace of those who aren't able to learn. We need to do something about this. And there are examples of where curriculum has changed. Vietnam is a good example where things have been done in a way that has helped to reform this, but generally the pattern is adverse. And of course the issue around the deployment of teachers. Where are the best teachers? They're often in the locations where the most advantaged students are. There are a number of programs that have tried to give incentives to teachers to go and teach in disadvantaged areas, issues around career progression, issues around local recruitment of teachers that have had variable success, but really important to be thinking about this as a principle. And they need learning materials, but not just any old learning materials. They need learning materials that are in the right language, that are at the right pace, and that teachers know how to use, have the training in using them. These might be learning materials that are on tablets. They might be hard copies of things, but not just seeing tablets as the panacea. They need these tablets also need to have the principles of others being able to use them and understand the best way to get the best out of them for the children who otherwise wouldn't be learning, not just for those who can already make use of them. Importantly, it's not just about the sort of inputs and so on, it's about the accountability processes that are there. So again, the work of the Asa and Oezo and others on trying to provide an evidence base to parents and communities to help empower them to hold schools to account, to have a dialogue with students, with schools, with teachers about where they see the problems and help, and ideally to find solutions together, not for it to be a carrot and a stick or to sort of be one against the other, but how can they work together to find solutions. And then finally, the point that I was just making about adopting a progressive universalism approach to the distribution of education financing. I'm going to then end on the issue about how we need to think also not only about the policy issues, but as many of us here are sort of interested in the planning of education, how we need to also include the data and measurement in going forward. We do have a lot of data. We have an increasingly rich resource of data. Really important to use what's out there, not to reinvent the wheel. But at the same time, there's far more we need to be doing better. So one is about, as I was mentioning earlier, looking at how we're measuring wealth, making sure we've got understanding what we're measuring, having comparable measures, etc. Include measures on disability more comprehensively, not just in the odd case of rural Pakistan, for example. But also there are other groups that are also left out, groups like street children, for example. So let's also think about those other invisible groups and make sure that we're not neglecting them because they're not being measured. In the UK, for instance, a lot of the analysis and evidence comes from linking different data sets. So it's not about just sort of using one data set, but saying, okay, we've got this household data set, but we've also got this school data set. How can we bring them together to inform our planning overall? It's perfectly possible to do so if thought has gone into the structuring of it. We need to be doing more of that and be using that more smartly in order to help inform policy. And of course, again, I know this is something that IIEP has been working on, we need to look at the sort of wider range of skills. So I've been talking about learning at the most basic in terms of maths and literacy. But of course, we know that educational systems are far more than that. And again, there are approaches to trying to measure non-cognitive skills, to measure advanced skills, to see what happens when children and young people progress through the system. We need to sort of think about that in a more robust way than we have at the moment. So I'm just going to end by giving you a very quick snapshot of some of the work we're doing in the Real Centre, which tries to promote an evidence base around these issues. We've got a work that's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and the Department for International Development in India and Pakistan, looking at effective teaching, particularly for the most marginalised and children with disabilities in particular. We're working with CAMFED to look at not only the impact of their programme, but how possibilities to scale it up and replicate it in a cost-effective way. In the sort of donor speak, looking at value for money with an equity lens. We're working with the PAL network, which is this network of organisations, including ASA and Oezo, amongst others, to look at their case studies of measuring assessment, showing the problems with who's learning, but also how they're using this assessment data to lead to action and change. And we're doing a couple of evaluations, looking at tracer studies of those that have been out of school and then gone into non-formal education programs to see their experience of education, what they're learning, their opportunities for rejoining the formal system or their transitions into work and how these programs have benefited them or what the problems have been, again with an equity lens. So as you can see, there's a common theme there. We have a number of different publications that range from journal articles, which maybe not everybody accesses, so we try as much as possible to write blogs, to put things in policy briefs and policy documents like this one that's funded by DFID called this Heart paper, get things in the media, this piece in the national newspaper, The Guardian, that really helps to try and get things into a a wider audience and help to mobilise a public debate on issues. And finally, if you happen to be in Cambridge on the 28th of June, we've got an event that will take a whole day to discuss these issues that I'm discussing in an hour. So do join us, and that will also be live streamed. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pauline. It seems clear to me when you read the analysis that Pauline and her colleagues have done, it's clear that they've had tremendous influence on the thinking of the Education Commission, and I think that's only right. The Commission's use of the term progressive universalism, I think, which is a very interesting concept. I think Pauline's presentation gave more meat to it in terms of progressive convergence and learning, which I think is something to really think about. So on the occasion of the recent passing of Juan Carlos Tedesco, who was the former director of IBE, UNESCO's International Bureau for Education, and the first head of IIEP's office in Buenos Aires, I, of course, was reviewing some of his work. I clicked on a link from IBE's online tribute to Juan Carlos, which brought me to his 2016 reflection, which he wrote for IBE. It was entitled 10 Notes on Learning Assessment Systems. And he's quite a critical perspective on that. But I want to quote him because I think it's very much in line with what Pauline's trying to do. He said, "We must stop considering evaluation as an end in itself, and instead look upon it as a tool to serve the aims of social justice." And I think that's really what Pauline's analysis is trying to contribute to put social justice first. Yes, it's true, we won't reach the new education goals unless we pay attention to those that are most disadvantaged. But it's also a matter of social justice that we must pay attention to these things. Pauline's analysis is building on a long history of research, which I remember being engaged in the 70s, 80s, let me say 80s, or which is referred to as the determinants of achievement. And it's James Coleman, it's Stephen Heinemann, and which both of whom had a somewhat fatalistic approach. It was all about a student's background. And of course, as educators, we continue to stand by our belief that education can transform social inequalities. So I very much like the statements about it's not inevitable. So rejecting fatalism. It is possible to achieve progress in both access and learning while also reducing inequalities. So I think that's a really powerful message from your presentation. There's some things that this analysis also, some other things that it's advanced. For example, we've known for some time that poor rural girls are the most disadvantaged in accessing education. Pauline has presented quite compelling evidence about how poor rural girls are also disadvantaged in terms of learning. And I think that's very important. Most disadvantaged, not only access, therefore access to learning opportunities because of low access, but even when they are in school, poor rural girls have lower levels of learning. The statistics from Niger are particularly shocking. You didn't present them here, but they're in the paper. They're shocking for how low both the rich and the poor are learning, but it's also the multiplier. About 10% of children from the richest households in Niger complete primary schooling having learned the basics, while less than 1% of the poorest achieve this. It's a factor of 10, but even overall, it's very low. So it's important to pay heed to the piece of analysis that Pauline covered in monitoring absolute progress as well as relative progress. So relative progress in terms of the rich and the poor, but also where we are in learning. I was impressed with several other findings, that cognitive differences at age 5 are strongly associated with learning at age 8 and 12. early learning, early childhood. Future opportunities as well. Poor households who were not learning at age 8 are very unlikely to access higher education. This really brings home the importance of strong primary education, particularly lower primary education. And I appreciated the highlighting of more recent thinking about wealth, where income data has been so problematic, especially in economies where the non-formal economy is the economy, and the whole sensitivity about asking about income and how do you measure income? Is it the cows that you also own, et cetera, and the unreliability of that measurement. So it's good. I was pleased to see that you've been using this alternative measure. And I appreciate you pushing us, and I think we all need to pay attention to this, that there are now known ways to measure, to find out, to get information on school children with disabilities and how much they're learning. And we need to really pay attention to this. I think it's been a bit too easy to just say, well, there's no data. But there are, in fact, ways to gather that data. So Pauline's presentation had two pieces to it, analyzing the intersections of wealth, gender, and location, and for rural Pakistan, disability, in explaining learning differences, including higher education access. And the second part was on distribution of public education expenditures by wealth. Now here, you didn't spend as much time as I might have liked to present that. So I really encourage you all to read that second paper as well, because it's a even richer analysis, looking at I don't know how many countries we have here on typology of countries in relation to relative and absolute improvement in learning levels, and there's a lot of interesting work, studies, analysis on expenditure, and it brought to mind a recent book that sort of takes a bit of a wider argument. So in 2016. Some scholars from Stanford, Frank Adamson, Bjorn Astrand, and Linda Darling-Hammond, a name many of you will know, published a book called Global Education Reform. It's rather overstating the global, because it's really a study of 3 pairs of countries. But it's a very interesting analysis, the subtitle of which is How Privatization and Public Investment Influence Education Outcomes. So basically, and so I think that these are quite complementary analysis, and when we always trained as a researcher, I always think, okay, so what are the additional research questions that we need to pursue? And I think this has promise for taking your work even further. So Frank Adamson and his colleagues did pairs of countries. So they looked at the governance approach, sort of a social democratic command approach and a neoliberal free market, public investments and state management versus privatization, deregulation, decentralization. And the countries they studied were, so under social democratic, public investment, state management were Finland and Cuba. Sweden was more on the privatization, and with the United States, Canada. So the pairs were Chile and Cuba. So Cuba being more obviously more state controlled, and Chile having gone into vouchers in a big way. Finland and Sweden, where Sweden had done a lot of privatization in the past 10, 15 years. Canada and the United States. And it's really very interesting that they take a historical perspective. They look at the shifts, the policies, and they conclude that the countries that have put most of the much of the investment for education comes from public sources, that those countries are much better off in addressing in terms of inequalities within society. And it's a very compelling argument, which I recommend to you. So going to the other, some questions for you. I know we'll get some good questions from people in the audience. So it's like we do we have any sense of what's behind some of the progress that we see? So, for example, you remarked on the progress in Kenya. What are countries doing? What policies have been enacted that are bringing about the reduction in the relative difference of rich and poor in learning levels? And I'd like you to say a bit more with your argument when poor children are given the same opportunities as rich children. So I think you're talking about several levels. You've got if they're in government schools, if they're in well-resourced schools, but also in the same classrooms. And what are the difficulties in actually providing that? I think I always like to see the second analysis of some of the existing data, and I loved your plug for making better use of all the data that's available. At IEP, we're trying to position ourselves in a niche related to the learning agenda. That our focus should be on the use of learning data, integrating it into the planning process, so the education sector analysis, so that we understand the nature of the inequalities, not simply access, but also the inequalities in learning levels in a country. And to integrate it into the plan preparation, choices of strategies, etc., but also into the monitoring and evaluation. So we are joining with other parts of UNESCO to really rethink EMIS. EMIS has to be more than the annual school census. The annual school census, which counts a lot of different things, but nothing on learning, and it's not very nuanced. So we really need an education management information system that is much broader, something that encompasses a quality assessment framework, including the learning data. So we're in lots of discussions with colleagues at headquarters, regional offices, UIS, for example, to think about this, and we'd like to, as an institute for planning and management, monitoring and evaluation is a really important piece of that. So we'd like to help member states move forward in that area. I'd like to ask you a few questions about where do you see the biggest data gaps? What are the next research questions? That's a really broad one. You can say whatever you like, and that's a nice giveaway to you for whatever new project you would like to plug. But also, I was really interested in the paper where there's some discussion about the accelerated learning programs, because given how many children we have out of school, children who have been pushed out of systems, dropped out, forced out for reasons beyond their control, we do need to have alternative education for them. And there are many experiments going on in accelerated learning processes, but I'm not sure how much we know. There's a bit of, you talk a bit about speed schools in Ethiopia, et cetera. And is this a really fruitful direction for future research? But in conclusion, let me just say how much we appreciate the analysis. There's so many analyses, so much work here, but also in I don't mind you advertising the Real Center at our seminar. Not at all. I think we would like to be sure that we're tracking that and pulling that content to share with our main audience, as planners and policymakers, through our IEP Learning Portal. And we will be in touch, of course, about blogs and content, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to make a commitment that we'll have someone come to the June conference in Cambridge. I think it will be a very good event. So those are my comments. We'd like to, shall I give you a chance to answer some, and then we open up to the floor? Or?
As you prefer.
Yes. Okay. I asked a lot of questions.
So, and they were excellent questions, but maybe I won't answer quite all of them to allow time for questions. But I think then maybe there might be some, like, on what's behind progress, a fundamental question. But I'd love to hear from people here, because I suspect there's a lot of experience here of people where there has been progress, and to learn from that. Because I guess, you know, there are always the obvious examples that we hear, Vietnam being one, of a country that has not only invested sufficient resources, but also really paid attention to those principles that I was putting up there. So those principles aren't that, it's not that Vietnam listened to me saying those principles are there because Vietnam and other countries that have made progress have done that. So they're all sort of based on evidence of countries that have that made a difference. I think that at the moment there's a bit of a sort of backlash against, oh, we look at countries that are spending more and they're still not doing very much, so money doesn't matter. And so I liked the example that you were giving from this book, because I think it's not that money alone matters, but not having money does matter. And I think just hearing some making the claims that, oh, we need to move beyond saying we need more money is a dangerous one. But at the same time, of course, we need to be smarter about how we're using that money. And we can see, and I think the examples that you were giving, we can see those countries that are making progress, they are the ones that are spending around 20% of their budgets on education. They are the ones that are seeing education as a priority. Of course, that's not the only thing. It's about how they're allocating. So the Nepal at the top of that graph that I was showing, that was allocating its resources more equally. Again, a sort of important message for other countries. I think it's great the work that your IIP is doing in really promoting not only making sure the quality of data is better, but also the use of data. And I think, to me, that is really important, because although we know, and Sue and I were at a meeting recently where the sort of one of the statements was that we're in a post-truth era where increasingly these high-level politicians, the people that are our global leaders, are making claims that evidence doesn't matter, we don't need experts. And at the same time, the point was made, we're in an era where we have more data and evidence than ever before, and there's no excuse anymore for evidence not to inform policy. So somehow we need to actually, as those of us who have the evidence and the data in our hands, the onus is on us to really continue to advocate using that evidence and to hold them to account and not let them get away with it. So I think, to me, that's really crucial, the role that the IIP is playing in that. We're working with the UNESCO Institute for Statistics on developing a handbook looking at issues around equity, looking at the extent to which national education plans are already addressing equity. Again, I know something IIP has done, and we worked in partnership with IIP when I was working with the GMR on that. But I think that's also important. So when you're asking about the data gaps, yes, sort of data of the right quality and of the right type on learning is really important, not the high stakes data on learning, but the data that can help improve education systems. But within that, really making sure we are measuring equity within MS, because I think, we only have the gender breakdown. Yeah. But there's no excuse not to include other dimensions. It's not always easy, but to think about how that can be done better, because that is, the MS data ultimately is such an important resource. And there's a huge amount of data in the MS data sets that just doesn't get used. I don't know if anyone's ever done an analysis of what proportion of MS data actually gets used, but I suspect that in many countries it's only a fraction. So let's be smarter about what we're collecting data on and what we need it on, and not collect and sort of input all these data that we're not using. Maybe there's data there that we should be using and we just don't know about it. A couple of things quickly on the next research questions. I think for me, one of the big issues about the transitions, what happens when children move from one part of the system to the other? How can we smooth those transitions? How can we make sure that they do move from early childhood into primary, into lower secondary? What's happening that sort of makes that disjointed? And for me, one of the issues around data there is this really rich resource, the Young Lives data, but it's rare and the funding for it is coming to an end. So what more, if without that type of longitudinal data, we're not going to be able to necessarily answer some of those important policy questions. Again, in the UK and in the US, those type of data are fundamental to informing education policy. Again, whether or not policymakers listen is another matter, but it's there. And lastly, just to pick up on the point on the accelerated learning programs, again, this is one of the things we reviewed in one of the recent global monitoring reports, the one on youth and skills, and we had somebody map out. And I mean, it is, I have to say, I think frustrating is maybe an understatement of how fragmented not just the information is, but the programs are still very small scale, still not supported by government, or those that are providing them not linking up sufficiently with government. So I think there's still a lot that we need to do. We know for many years that we haven't been doing right, and we still need to do something about it. And I would say, so just another sort of piece of information of work we're doing with MasterCard Foundation, looking at secondary education in Africa, mapping out what evidence exists, and this is one of the areas we've identified as a gap that we need to get some sort of analysis on. And if we're looking at secondary education, that we need to look at it in terms of not just the formal system, but more broadly in terms of what type of education is out there and what type of education is going to be best suited for relevant skills that young people need.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Pauline. The floor is open. I welcome your comments. Okay, let's, see a few hands. Thanks, Camilla. Okay, Miyoko, water.
Thank you very much for the presentation and the discussion. I want to pick up on what Sue mentioned.
Oh, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, sorry.
Can you hear it? No.
The microphone working?
Now it's
yeah,
working.
Thank you. I'm Miyoko Saito from IIEP, and thank you very much for the presentation and also the follow-up discussion by Sue. And so I want to pick up on the, well, one of the points that Sue was mentioning about the earlier study by Pauline, followed by Heinemann, Roxley, and Hanushek, etc., on the effect of the socioeconomic status on the learning. Now, what they used to be said is that Coleman was saying, yes, SES is actually influencing everything on the learning, but that was, and then Hanushek and all the other company said that that was because that was on the industrial countries, and it's not the case in the developing countries. But then, when, well, some other people came later on to attack even to say that, well, it depends on how the SES is measured, because if we use the kinds of items that are only geared for the industrialized countries, then everybody in the developing countries will be labeled poor. So there is no way of comparing whether in those developing countries.
No differentiation.
Yeah. So now, picking up on that, that thing, I'm really glad to see one of the early slides of the Pauline saying that how the house is made is actually going into that scale of SES, which also echoes what well, when IIEP is working very closely with the faculty a long time ago, that actually made a difference in terms of the more precise measure of the SES. And then coming to that point, I'm just wondering how, or whether you have some idea about how we should measure the disability. To make sure that that's going to give a real fair measures of the real what we mean by disability.
Okay. Thank you. Could you pass the mic? Oh, Camilla and Therese. We'll take a couple of questions and then come back to our speaker.
Thank you very much, Pauline and Sue. It's quite interesting. And I have a question though. From the point of view of learning, looking at SES, yes, but you've not mentioned anything, and in Africa this is so true, of the level of education or of the parents. You know, I mean, learning, you can be from very poor family or background, but sometimes when the mother especially has some education, even not much, I say this because I would have loved to also see the issue of literacy flag, because if you ignore it, most of these poor are also illiterate. And sometimes, especially in Africa too, you have the rich, but because the background of the mother in particular, educational background is low, you don't see much of a difference. So that's on the side of the learning. But on the side of the financing also, I want to know whether you had really looked into some policies of the World Bank that have promoted pro-poor, and why didn't it work? Because when we talk about financing, I would really like to understand a little bit on the attitude of government, the political aspect of this, politics in education. Because of the time limit, most of the time government don't focus on this type of outcomes. They're not interested. And their focus more is on being re-elected and very much linked to the mandate, the period that they'll be in government. So it's not a long-term thing. But I very much appreciate, because for years we've talked about early learning, and there's always the argument, what's the value of investing in early education? So I mean, I really, in particular, like that part of it, because we've been for a very long time looking at the issue of investing in early childhood education, but the arguments that have been, and the evidence were never there. Now that the evidence there, do you think that will change the attitude of governments? And maybe can you speak to a little bit on maybe areas where probably, especially to the IIEP, have you, in your analysis, really negotiated these, and have you got any results from governments you work with, especially in Africa? Thank you very much.
Okay, shall we go respond on those two? And
So I think there are some very good points, not necessarily that I can answer them all, or they will have answers. On the issue around the measurement of socioeconomic status, I fully agree with you on the sort of housing always comes out as being the most important in terms of looking at variability across. One of the points that I was making was about the importance of having comparable wealth information, ideally, for those of us that are looking at these issues that, as you were saying, at the moment doesn't really exist in the way that we would want. So we're trying to sort of piece things together. And I mean, part of the reason why we're only really looking at countries that are within a similar wealth range of the sort of in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, is because if you try and extend beyond that, it starts to get really fuzzy. So I sort of think those are important points. On disability, I mean, there's a lot of work that's going on. You're probably aware of this network called the Washington Group that have identified ways to identify children who have different types of difficulties. So they're calling it difficulties rather than disabilities. And they're doing a lot of testing of the reliability and the validity of the questions that they're asking. And it does seem, they do seem to be coming out as quite robust. So I think, and this was partly the point I was making, and Sue, I think you were also reiterating that there's no excuse because there are ways of doing it. It's going to be a question that sometimes, you know, there's a number of different questions that you have to ask to get the information because of the range of types of disabilities, etc. So how can it can be done in an efficient way where, you know, you can't be in households for such a long time, etc. So there are questions there. There's probably for some of them a question sometimes of what they are actually measuring, but I think that the work that they're doing is really rigorous, and I think, you know, I think we can be confident that we are moving in the right direction, and there are things that people can already be increasingly using. Yes, literacy is hugely important. Actually, in some of the analysis, we have included that. I mean, I didn't make it explicit, but it is within the analysis. And we've got actually in the Education Commission paper, we do have one of the graphs which looks at the additional gap that comes about as a result of different factors. So wealth being the most prominent. We add on to that when you look at mothers' literacy, how much difference that makes, and that also does make a big difference. We look at location and so on. So I would fully agree with you that it's not important. I should have made a point more explicitly about it. It's also, as you say, the literacy of parents from this demographic and health survey data, some analysis we included in one of the global monitoring reports, how sort of even after 4 or 5 years of schooling, many of the mothers, the women in the households couldn't read a sentence. Now that might be sometimes because they've lost their literacy, you know, weren't in school long enough to retain it, they were not in literate environments. There's lots of different reasons that we know about, but you know, hugely important. So on the pro-poor, that on the one hand you've got maybe the World Bank or others, IIEP, sort of promoting with governments the importance of a pro-poor approach, but not necessarily happening. Why that doesn't happen, I think maybe Sue will be in a better position to answer that than me. But I think, yeah, as you say, I think you answered the question in a way. There's the issues around the politics as much as the sort of the way in which evidence gets used. If it's a short-term election period, you know, we can see in my experience, for example, of being in Malawi, they abolished school fees, primary school fees. That was a great election winner. Done that. Now let's move on. The next election, it was about secondary school fees and abolishing that. You know, where were the resources coming from? How pro-poor was that going to be? That wasn't part of it. It was okay. People were going to vote for it. the issue around the sort of how policy gets made versus the evidence that's there. So I think very important points that don't have all the answers to.
Thank you, Pauline. Other questions or comments? I'd encourage you to speak from your own experience, from your own country experience in reaction to Pauline's presentation. Jim, you have a comment or question?
Yeah.
With the microphone. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Camilla.
Yeah, it seemed that a lot of the power of the analysis was in the sort of binary presentation of the richest and the poorest. Is it not the case that in a lot of countries, 90% of the population is actually poor? And therefore, we also need to be making an argument for a minimum level of investment in education that can bring about some kind of learning outcome, because I think in some countries the investment is simply too low. So focusing on just the inequalities, that just those two ends of the spectrum, maybe just weakens that argument a little bit. The thing I was really pleased to see was the focus on disabilities. Interesting to know what happens in your conference, but I also know that within the disability community, there's a lot of tension between the people who push for social inclusion, including my former agency, UNICEF, and quite often the disability organizations who say with the social inclusion that learning outcomes actually deteriorate because the children don't have the facilities in resource-poor environments to actually respond to their learning needs. So just any comments on that?
Okay. Another comment? Yes.
Je vous remercie beaucoup pour votre présentation très intéressante. Moi, je travaille sur la question d'éducation inclusive.
Il faut attendre un tout petit moment quelques.
C'est bon.
Donc, je disais que je travaille sur la question d'éducation inclusive concernant enfants en situation de handicap dans une perspective de comparaison internationale. Et il se trouve que l'agenda international recommande la prise en compte des personnes handicapées dans des critères d'éducation. Et sur le terrain, en tout cas en ce qui concerne les recherches que je mène, je suis confrontée surtout à un problème de disponibilité de données. Et puis, il y a aussi, sur le plan pratique, la prise en compte du handicap même au sein de l'école. Donc, la formation des enseignants, la disponibilité des communautés, la formation des accompagnants, ce qui complique un peu la situation d'accès et de participation à l'école des personnes en situation de handicap. Et dans votre présentation, vous avez commencé à parler justement de cette question-là et en y ajoutant aussi une dimension qui m'intéresse particulièrement, c'est-à-dire la situation des filles en situation de handicap. Parmi toutes les filles qui sont à l'école, il y a aussi cette spécificité qui n'est pas très remontée en surface pour que leurs préoccupations soient aussi prises en compte. Et je me demande si dans vos recherches, vous avez l'intention d'aller plus loin pour mettre en évidence aussi le cas en situation de handicap. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. Okay, yes, Jim and here. Oh, one more? One more. Go ahead.
Thank you. Shadra, I'm from Zimbabwe, a student on the advanced training program at IIEP. First of all, I'd like to thank Rose for this presentation, also the IIEP for arranging this strategic debate. And that's when I was got excited because I'm a product of the University of Cambridge, and I'm 34 years back. In fact, my high school certificate is from Cambridge. Yeah. So, but the issue is what continues to dog us, you know, is the academics. They've tended to remain in their own category. in terms of the research and findings. Yet, the policymakers are on the other side. What do you suggest should be done to bring about the marriage of the two institutions? This is the major challenge, and I would like to actually to commend IIEP for its efforts of bringing practitioners like us, to come to actually learn from research so that we can go and practice in our own countries. However, I still feel at our own levels we remain experts, and at the end of the day, we are more or less like academic system. We also fall back into the academic field, even though we will be, because the policymakers, we don't make the decisions ourselves, right? So as long as we have this gap, and as long as we don't narrow it, like what is happened perhaps in medicine and agriculture and industry, where we've seen there's a close relationship between research findings and the policies which come up. It seems we'll continue to go in circles. We remain in the silos, in our own silos. What do you suggest should be best be done in order that we bring about this marriage, so that one day we can have a wedding, and then our SDG 4 can be achieved by 2030. You see, we towards that, for example. What do you think would be the best?
Thank you. Thank you.
So to start with the first two, and then I'll come on to that last very important question as well. So on the, I had intended to try and show that learning levels overall are low, but there's a gap between them. And yes, indeed, we need more resources, but it's also about the distribution. So if I didn't get that across strongly enough, I will need to up my game on that. But I think that's hugely important. It's not only about the fact that we've got a gap, it's also that we don't have enough money and we don't have enough resources for the education system more generally, but certainly at the lower levels of education, but also across the whole system. I think there was a sort of synergy between the two sets of questions on disability and inclusion, mainstreaming versus special schools, huge debates that continue to go on. Again, I think we're sort of moving into a situation where we are increasingly getting evidence on these things. Data is improving, but it's an area where it's still lacking. I should say my colleague, Dr. Nidhi Singhal, is an expert on these issues and could answer this question far better than I can, but it is one that we have been debating. So in the work that we're doing in India and Pakistan, I think we were quite struck by, in the parts of those countries that we're working in, that the children with disabilities, and our researchers saw it with their own eyes, it's not just the data, they are increasingly in schools. But it's of no surprise probably that, as you were saying, the teachers don't have the skills and the knowledge of how to support them. So there are examples in some countries of having specialised teachers who move from around different schools. I think Kenya might have been one, move around different schools to provide support. There's not enough resources to have them in each school, so resources still is an issue. There's an issue on the sort of types of disability and the severity of disability as to whether and when mainstream schooling is the most appropriate, and those debates go on in the UK as well as in countries like India and Pakistan. So I don't think we've resolved these issues. Ultimately, there are huge resource issues, but it certainly goes beyond that as well. And I would very much encourage you to look at the work of Nidhi Singhal, who has, together with other colleagues in the area, have been debating some of these issues. You get me started on the issue about linking up evidence and academics with policymakers, and we might be here far after the cocktail, so you might need to stop me. Hugely important, and Sue and I were at a meeting that I was mentioning earlier, the Building Evidence in Education meeting, which is very much about, and our discussions were very much about trying to link the evidence and those that are producing the evidence with those in the policy world. One of the sort of terms that's used is about linking up the demand for evidence with the supply for evidence. You've got sometimes researchers going off and developing their research questions which might not be at all of interest or relevance to those on the ground that are having to devise policy. Sometimes maybe you need that, but other times it's just a lack of conversation and engagement, that they're asking the wrong questions in the first place. And then it's a question as to, once the evidence is there or as it's being produced, how is that best communicated to policymakers? And is it about, you know, we increasingly are seeing in academia academic writing blogs, producing policy papers. Does anyone read them? Who reads this? So I think there is a lot more that's happening on the side of, you know, talking with an academic hat on. There can be frustrations because these things take a lot of time, and one still gets frustrated that, well, policymakers are just going with the latest fad and not necessarily reading them, or it doesn't seem as if they're reading them. Maybe that's not right, but then maybe academics aren't communicating in the right way. So we need to learn better what it is and what are the right processes, or what are the right intermediaries to work through to make that link better. So I think it's a hugely important question. I do think there has been a shift in recent years. It's not that it's never been there, but it's becoming more explicit, the need to address it. And with social media, with websites and so on, there's less excuse for it to not happen, but still a long way to go.
And Pauline's part of this impact initiative, which is aimed at having research have an impact, meaning influencing policy and practice. It's quite interesting. If you Googled impact initiative, you'll see some frameworks and thinking about how to make research matter more. I think one of the issues in academia is the will to engage in that kind of research. So I'm a former academic. One of my greatest frustration is that applied research was not valued, even though I was in a graduate school of education. It was not valued as much as other forms of research. But even when you have the will, there are so many other constraints. Whose issues are you working on? Are you working on an issue that policymakers care about? How do you know? Are you in consultation with policymakers to understand what are the issues they're grappling with? Or that, I mean, here at IIEP, we try to think about the issues also that they're going to be grappling with in 5 years. Some research in those areas. You've got a lot of issues. There are quite a few lessons known about how to increase the application of research into policy and planning, and Noel McGinn has written a great deal about this. But one of the factors is the timeliness. Information at the wrong time is less likely to be used. So again, it's whose issue, and is it the right time? Is it a fertile environment for that work, etc. And then again, very much the translation into forms which are digestible, understood, etc. We have very consciously made shifts here at IIEP about how we present research results, and we have a far more diverse set of formats now. Fewer books and more on policy briefs and country notes and guidelines, etc. The translation to better influence policy and practice, but it's a work in progress for sure. Yes, Michaela, Anton, and Hugues. The front. We're going to hear from the front row now.
Yeah, pressure's on.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pauline, for this very enlightening presentation and introducing the notion of progressive universalism. And I think the issue that is behind it is really how to target resources, the medias, and finding out where the medias are located is, of course, a very important first step. Huh? So I was just thinking about the measures that can be behind, and also thinking about the current discussion here in France now. It's, of course, the development. A flagship measure of the French presidency is actually to halve the class size of children in schools located in disadvantaged areas. And I wanted to have your idea on that. Do you think it's a good idea to do that? is it something that can be considered as a strategic lever, really, to achieve a greater equality in education?
The old class size debate.
Yeah, I have a question about the global advocacy on on education, because the two documents you presented were written as background papers for the Education Commission within the learning generations. Also, there's a strong sense on how we advocate at global and very high political level for education. And in the report at the end, and it's very interesting, you said that similar schooling offers kind of similar schooling opportunities, offer kind of similar outcomes or closer outcomes for the richest and the poorest. And at the end, you also say that there are also external determinants that we don't deal within the education system, but that we know are also very important. It also relates to the question of pro-poor, but global pro-poor policies. So in a way, to be, in a sense, all the partners or stakeholders of education at global level to kind of have a strong influence in the trade-offs that are made for education, because it requires not only money, but also kind of political will, because to reallocate funding from, let's say, higher education for the richest to primary education for the poorest to be fast, it also requires kind of political will. You have to overcome resistances. So maybe don't you think we should have a more holistic approach on all the determinants of education, not only that as education experts we kind of are able to know, to provide evidence on within the education system, but also all the rest of it. Of course, I know that my question is a bit naive because we do it also. There are a lot of impact evaluation that we use from programs with external determinants from education. But at the global level, shouldn't we have this more holistic approach of all, let's say, social sectors that are determinants to school?
Okay, I enjoyed the presentation. There isn't much I disagree with, so I looked for things to disagree with, but this is supposed to be debate. So there are 3 points I want to mention. The first one is similar to what Jim mentioned, but I want to emphasize it. I'm wondering if this comparison between 20% rich and 20% poor, that presupposes to some extent that there is an almost balanced and almost, you know, and very, how to say this? Yeah, a very normal distribution, which I really think is not the case in many countries. I'm not too surprised to see that the 20% richest in Chad learn little, because actually the 20% richest in Chad include a hell of a lot of poor people. It's only the 3% richest in Chad who are too rich. And so I'm wondering if, when you do the analysis again by looking more, for instance, at 5% rich and 95% poor, if you would get different results, and it would be interesting to do the analysis again. Second point is more, the second and the third point about the policy recommendations, because that's an issue. And I was unhappy. Well, I was doubtful when you put down empower parents and communities to hold schools to account, without mentioning much about the fact that there is also a need to strengthen professionalism among the teaching, head teachers, and so on. And it's a point I've been making since a little while. There is a need for a balance between accountability and professionalism, and I'm afraid that that balance has been lost. We have put so much emphasis on holding people accountable, and we've done very little to strengthen them as teachers. I was much happier when subsequently you said that this social accountability should lead to dialogue and to collaboration, and there I fully agree. But that dialogue and collaboration will work better when at the same time we also try to strengthen teacher professionals. I know you agree, but I think it's useful to just mention. And the last point is a point in monitoring and evaluation, important. Student achievement, very important. And then what we tend to do is indeed to measure this through learning, reading and writing. And actually, I was fortunate to participate about 2 years ago, I think, in a presentation on young lives done in Ethiopia, where one of the people behind the whole Young Lives research made the point that there is more of a relationship between what you could call the social skills of children at the age of 6 or 7 their confidence, and so on, their ease of relationships with others, and their later career in school and in life, than between their capacity to read 60 words or whatever per minute, which is the way it is being used. And I'm really worried there. Of course, you make the point, yes, monitoring and evaluation should be mainly for learning. It should not necessarily be for accountability only, it should be for learning. Learning for us, not for learning, I mean, it should be for improvement.
Yeah.
You make the point, it should include cognitive, non-cognitive, and other skills and so on. But so far, unfortunately, most of what we do is to measure the easily measurable. It's just, I mean, maybe we are a little naive when we say, oh, but that tool, that the tool exists and it should not be used for what it actually can most easily be used. And somewhere when we develop those tools, we are to some extent accountable for the way they will be used, even if that use is not our intended use. So I would like to hear a little bit more, because in the beginning you mentioned there was a debate on this. It would be good on that point to hear a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, great set of questions, and I think actually we probably agree with each other, not surprisingly, but we're amongst friends, so that's good. It's always difficult to debate when no, but some important points. I would love to be an advisor to Macron, but I'm not sure I'll be called upon. I was pleased to have the opportunity to meet Thomas Piketty the other day, and maybe he could help to move his analysis from the sort of economy more generally into education and help to advise on some of these issues. I know that your first speaker, I think, in these debates was Andreas Schleicher, who has done some important work looking at the issues of class size, the trade-offs between reducing class size and investing in teachers. And my sort of understanding of his message is investing in teachers on balance. It's not to say ideally you wouldn't be choosing one or the other, but that is has a bigger impact on children's outcomes. But I think there's a lot of contextual issues one would need to take into account. What are the class sizes? I mean, it's a question about redistributing resources to those most disadvantaged areas, so them both having better teachers as well as reduced class sizes, etc. So I wouldn't be able to claim I know enough about France to give an answer to that. On the issue around the sort of external factors and not only looking at the in-school factors, I was trying to keep within my 50-minute time limit. Work that we've done, but also within the Education Commission, they do also bring out the point of the importance of the sort of sectoral policy, not just looking within education. Sort of very important issues around tackling early marriage, about tackling child labour, about the impact that conditional cash transfers have in not just in addressing poverty, which in turn has an impact on children's education. So yeah, I certainly agree with you, and something to probably bring out more clearly. This sort of ongoing issue about the richest aren't rich. In fact, some of the analysis we have tried by doing different categorization. Sometimes it's quite difficult just because of sample sizes, so that's one of the problems. But when we have been able to do it, actually some of the analysis on higher education, we looked sometimes at the richest 10% and the poorest 50%, because even when you kept increasing the size of the poorest, you still only were getting fewer than 1% in school. So it was like, how are we going to make sure that there are some of the poorest that we're showing are going to be in school? So we have played around with that a bit, but I think it is an important point, and actually we go back to my colleagues and see if we can do some more work on that, and maybe others too. I mean, again, sorry, I have to agree with you. I actually don't like the word accountable, and as soon as I said it, that's where I sort of drew back on myself. So I'm glad that you spotted I did do that, but I think it is a sort of issue. I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the next Global Education Monitoring Report that's on accountability is going to be coming out in relation to this, because ultimately the word accountability makes it sound as if we're fighting with each other, or one is better than the other or has more authority than the other. And actually, unless we're working together, we're not going to see any improvement. So it's about having the evidence in everybody's hands that can have ensure an informed discussion, rather than that can help to level the power playing field, if you like. On this issue, I think I'm thinking of the same paper, probably on the sort of issue around social skills and confidence and so on in young lives. So we've used their data a bit, and we've actually also in the work that we're doing in India and Pakistan to try and measure these things. I think it's still something I think we've got to be careful about whether we know what we're measuring with what's in those data. And so I remember Lucy Lake from CAMFED giving the example once from that they're also using a very similar instrument. And what they found was that the more, so as they were tracking the girls who were in school for longer and were doing well in school, it seemed as if their levels of self-confidence, etc., were going down. Now, there might be different reasons for that. Her hypothesis was, well, that's just because they're becoming more aware, more articulate, perhaps more sort of feeling more confident themselves to say that they lack confidence. You know, there's all sorts of things going on. So there is an issue about what that's measuring. It's not to say that we shouldn't be looking carefully at what those results are and looking at them alongside other forms of learning. And a question that we've been asking ourselves about, you know, should these things also be seen as an outcome themselves rather than a means to an end of improving learning in the way I think you were also suggesting. So I think, you know, it's huge. These things are hugely important, but we probably need to continue to work on how to measure them appropriately to the extent that we think that's important.
Thank you.
For those questions.
One question.
Ooh, okay.
Sorry for coming back, especially on the question of learning. You've not mentioned even one the issue of the medium of instruction, language. You know, I mean, was that looked at in any way? Because, you know, why I say this is always when we look at the case of Finland, it's also because the child learns in the mother language right from the home. It's just taking you back to the role of the home and the parents being the first educators, and the fact that schools use another language. You measure a child may look brilliant and confident at home, but in school it's the opposite. Did it feature in the studies the issue of language?
And did you want to ask a question, Emily? Okay, we'll take one last question. Thank you.
Hi, just to bounce kind of on what you were saying.
Could you introduce yourself?
My name is Pauline. I'm from France.
So you can give us the answer.
Yeah. I did some research in Peru, and Peru was mentioned in your Young Life survey. I did a research in a rural school, which was based on the promotion of social inclusion, which had students from various socioeconomic backgrounds. In effect, there are still a lot of, you were talking about the gap that closes up when children from different economic backgrounds are in the same class. In effect, there are still some hegemonic power relations that persist. Language of instruction was huge, with Spanish being the main medium of instruction, even in a school like that, Quechua given no place, English given a huge amount of class time, which some students didn't benefit from. Some Quechuan students who didn't see the use of English were expected to reach the same level as children from Lima, and who eventually shut down completely. So there's also a problem of exclusion in the inclusion process, and I was really happy to see that you mentioned also equity. It's not only about equality, there's this, how do we put equity into the balance, and how do we allocate more room to the children who need it, those kind of issues.
Thank you. Last round.
So, okay, excellent. Important points again. I did in passing mention medium instruction in relation to textbooks, if textbooks aren't in the right language. So there's this study which gets cited over and over again, included in all these systematic reviews that keep coming up on learning, that shows that apparently textbooks didn't make a difference to children's learning. And then lo and behold, they found because the textbooks weren't in the right language. And it was like, okay, shouldn't they have checked that before they did this big, expensive randomized controlled trial? And sort of just the bee that I have in my bonnet is that gets included in the systematic review because it's methodologically robust. But in terms of the approach to the research, I would suggest maybe it wasn't. Yeah, the evidence, this is one of the areas in which the evidence is irrefutable that language instruction and learning in your mother tongue from an early age makes a huge difference to the ability to learn. Is very clear across a number of different contexts. Latin American countries giving also important experience of that, where there are programs of bilingualism. It doesn't necessarily get implemented in equal ways. So the principle is there, but not necessarily being implemented effectively. So I think, yeah, hugely important, and should certainly make sure that's a key part of an education strategy and debate.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for your engagement over the last hour and 3/4. We appreciate that very much. Pauline, don't give up on getting an advisory post with the new French government, because in 2013, the strategic debate featured a talk on decentralization by the newly appointed Minister of Education. So the new Minister of Education, the discussant was Anton de Gaulle. Perhaps he was the real draw.
Exactly.
Sure.
I think it's
I don't
you,
remember.
Anton.
I don't remember. But you know, we'll send the new minister update on the strategic debate. See who's been here. You know, so don't give up hope.
I look forward to the call.
All right. Well, at this point, I would just 2 things. I welcome you to join us upstairs for the cocktail. And would you please join us in thanking our speaker, Pauline Rose, for today's seminar. Thank you.